How can figurative art teaching sensitively work to address the gaze in contemporary figurative art? Figurative art has held an important place in art history, and although the context, narrative, and the gaze that surrounds the figure are changing to reflect shifts in societal views away from outdated modes, it holds an important and celebrated role in contemporary art. To fully understand why we are seeing changes in the role of figurative art education, the history of figurative art, its education, and the challenging themes surrounding it should be understood. Figurative art painting has been used in a range of ways throughout art history, but has a number of challenging themes which are currently trying to be addressed in contemporary art. The portrayal and difference of the male and female figures both hold strong and challenging themes relating to the gaze and teaching philosophies. The gaze in a broader context is simply to look or view a subject. In relation to figurative art, the gaze can lead to subjection of the figure, depending on gender, sexuality of the viewer, and the subject being viewed. In art history, the gaze has had a significantly heterosexual male-dominated viewpoint, from art teaching, art criticism, and in societal views. This bias, formed from the male perspective, or the male gaze, has historically tried to suppress the female gaze, causing confrontation and protest. Much of the critical discourse on the gaze, eminent from feminist theory, and deals with the emotional and moral wounds the objectifying male gaze inflicts on living, breathing women at work, in the home, and in every other situation. Contemporary feminist artists, as well as the wider contemporary arts period, are working to change these outdated narratives and create art that pushes back against these rhetorics, removing the objectifying narratives and working with education to promote change. This bias towards a specific gender and sexuality has left a distinct lack of diversity and has led to a heavily one-sided narrative which has affected portrayals of male and female figurative art, each in different ways but nonetheless each significant. The bias in the gaze has historically been seen in art teaching and has had significant effects on figurative art. The way in which figurative art and the life class has been taught is significant when we're talking about the narrative around the gaze, looking at how gender and sexuality has affected this, and how contemporary art teaching can work to sensitively address this. Early teaching art institutions favoured male life models and cadavers to teach anatomy, but the rising use of female models away from the commonality of male models could be due and perceived in a wide variety of ways, especially when the field of art was still a heavily male-dominated field. One point of discussion is the problematic way figurative art was taught. Historically, the relation to medical teaching of anatomy. This historically problematic teaching method describes the female figure to be an extension of the male body in a one-body model. This theory was prominent in both artistic teaching and in medical anatomical teaching. This perception of the female figure as an extension of the male form creates a narrative that seems lesser or unequal, especially when commonly the use of female biology in anatomical literature was limited to the female reproductive organs. This limitation to purely the reproductive implies the female body is an object for childbirth and fails to take into account the emotional and intellectual. This idea of the female body as purely a physical subject to be viewed is a common narrative seen in historical figurative art. Change is seen in the 19th century with better scientific understanding that the male and female bodies have fixed biological differences, and men and women's bodies were increasingly seen as incommensurate and made different from conception onwards, a two-body model. This coincides with the rising popularity of the female figure and female models in wider figurative art and education. The great academies such as the French Académie Royale did not use female models as much as male models until later in the 19th century. There are examples of the female figure in mainstream figurative art going back before this. The northern artist Rubens, however, was perhaps the preeminent artist of the nude female in the 17th century. This shift in education shows a shift in the narrative towards the figure, separating the male and female figure as two separate categories that still doesn't fully account for the heavy male narrative set into figurative art. This change in anatomical teaching is being seen in contemporary literature on drawing the figure, with Joseph Shepherd's book, Drawing the Female Figure and Drawing the Male Figure, illustrating how figurative literature can sensitively address and informatively educate readers on the male and female figure through the use of anatomy and artistic techniques to produce sensitive portrayals of the figure without comparing or linking to outdated narratives. This change reflects a changing narrative, science and societal views, but we must not generalise that this reflects in all art teaching. This idea of the one-body model and the male gaze is still visible in some pieces of figurative teaching. Douglas Graves' Figure Painting in Oil, 1979, clearly exposes the failure to transition away from outdated teaching, showing the female torso with the left breast removed, instead presenting what is assumed to be a male chest, with pectoral muscles clearly painted. Graves has then crudely painted an outline of where the left breast should be, highlighting the outdated and objectifying theory that the female body is an extension of the male figure. The increasing use of books to teach figurative art, like Joseph Shepherd's manuals, are not only educating in a current and progressive manner, without basing the study around one gender type, but they're also working to sensitively address the gaze around the figure, aiding readers to produce work that is eminent of fine art, rather than work that objectifies the figure, creating vulgar images that contemporary arts movement is working to avoid. Blake Wendon advises, avoid glamour poses that exaggerate the model's charms. This is especially relevant in the production of female figurative studies, which historically have seen more heavy objectification. But also the male figure, although the gaze is seen to be less subjective in comparison due to the heavily dominant male gaze. This contemporary way of teaching has been made available to a much wider audience, enabling this new understanding to work to combat the historical problems the gaze has caused. This in comparison of arts academies, whose audiences are smaller and limited. This new widespread literature, thanks to mass production and the internet, has brought the life class to the people in an accessible manner, but in doing so has increased the pressure to provide the right teaching material and theory, else the narrative of the gaze could become more subjective. Increasingly, artists have started to reject classical art academies in favour of their own learning outside the classroom or in smaller, more liberal art schools, due to the old-fashioned teaching methods and theories. Sheila Girling dropped out of the Royal Academy for this reason, whilst Lucian Freud attended the East Anglian School of Painting and Drawing, run by Cedric Morris, which used a much less structured curriculum. This rejection of classical education supports the idea of change, not through theory or methodology, but the rejection of these institutions entirely that have taught these problematic narratives, relying instead on lived experience and less structured forms of teaching, reflecting shifts in contemporary art and allowing artists to form their own view and perspective, whilst combating narratives in their own way. The way in which figurative art is taught is vital to causing the change that is happening in contemporary figurative art. The material and the way we are taught affects how we observe and look at art. Figurative art still has a prominent place in contemporary art, but the nature and narrative are changing. There is still a lot of work in educating future and current artists on the historical narrative, understanding the effect the gaze has had on figurative art teaching and the ongoing conversation around it. As part of the conversation, and understanding of these historically problematic themes allows us to understand that, although these can't be erased, teaching can work to address these related issues. Whilst the use of art academies and figurative literature have great importance in educating a broad range of society on the historic problems figurative art has caused, but but also in teaching how to produce figurative art in a sensitive manner and the importance of the effect it can have